doing along with the Task Force 5 under the G20. As you would have noticed, we have started this series of lectures for the last couple of weeks, and we are going to continue into the middle of May with these series of lectures. The topic that we have today is the all important item that is being discussed everywhere, extremely important, on climate finance, role of monetary and fiscal policy. I would welcome all of you. To chair the session today, we have Dr. Arvind Virmani, who was the chairman of our EGROW Foundation and now is a member at Niti Aayog. The speakers today are all of them very illustrious, and I'll be very brief in introducing them because they're so well known to everyone. So forgive me if I miss out certain things. Dr. Virmani is going to be chairing the session, and before he was the member of Niti Aayog, he was the executive director at the International Monetary Fund. Before that, he was the chief economic advisor of our country. He has worked in the Planning Commission for many years, and before that, he was with the World Bank. He has published extensively. His role in the 1991 reforms are known to all of us. He has also books, research books, to his credit. Our first speaker for the day is Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia. And actually, Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia in this country, as well as across the world, needs no introduction. He's been a civil servant, former deputy chairman of the Planning Commission. Most importantly, he was the first director at Independent Evaluation Office of the IMF. Our second speaker today is Dr. Frannie. Dr. Frannie is a finance and development expert. She was here with us just a few weeks back. Because of her expertise on the subject, we requested her to join again. She has worked in different capacities. She has been a senior vice president at the African Development Bank, vice president at the World Bank Group, and executive secretary of the African Capacity Building Foundation. In addition to having founded two companies, she is the CEO of Southbridge Investments. She is a board member, trustee, special advisor, founder, and member of a number of prestigious international organizations, including significantly contributing at the World Economic Forum. Our next speaker today, the third speaker for the day, is Professor Panda. He is a senior research associate with the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative at the United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security, Bonn. He works at the interface of research and policy on climate and disaster risk insurance and finance, agriculture and climate change, and human mobility. Before joining the UNU, he has worked with the London School of Economics and Political Science and International Research Institute on climate change impact assessment, climate change adaptation, climate finance, and climate smart agriculture. The last speaker for the day is Neha Kumar. Neha Kumar is the head South Asia Program Climate Bonds Initiative and is based in Delhi. She drives policy, strategy, and partner programs to scale up the green bonds market and sustainable financial ecosystem. She has also worked on the Ministry of Finance Working Group on Sustainable Finance Taxonomy Development. Our efforts are targeted at building mechanisms for credible transition finance mobilization and allocation. With this, I hand over the session to our chair for the day, Dr. Arvind Virmani. Sir, we can't hear you. Virmani, sir, we can't hear you.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry. Mr. Ahluwalia was just asking how long he's expected to speak. I guess with 4 speakers, 10 to 15 minutes, is that?
You decide whatever you like.
Yeah, no, Sharon has a format in mind, so I don't want to, and we have time.
10 to 15 minutes is perfect, sir, because there are going to be a few questions too. Manjeev Puri is also joining us today, and we have Dr. Dean from Goenka, who works on climate is also joining
Okay.
us today. So they may have a few minutes of observation.
Okay, okay. So let's start right away. And let's start with the first speaker who you already introduced, Montek ji. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Arvind. Given that you have limited time and given that there are so many working groups that have looked at this subject over the last several years, and even more have been now set up, I think most people looking at the subject are aware of the broad framework. So I just want to touch on a few things and maybe provoke a little bit the difficult issues. First of all, when we talk, I mean, I don't know whether your interest is in uh, climate finance for the developing world as a whole or climate finance for India.
Well, both. I think developing world and India. And
I'll kind of talk about what I know about India, and I mean, I'll say something about the developing world also.
sure.
It's quite clear that, you know, climate finance has to relate to both mitigation and adaptation. One important difference is that mitigation is a global public good. Adaptation is not a global public good, it's a local public good. So there is a sense in which, except for the poorest countries, the rest of the world will probably say that adaptation is none of our business. We are really involved in helping in mitigation. So I think we should be clear. Are we expecting international financial support for both adaptation and mitigation? And is that somehow going to be based on some moral criterion or not? Now, having said that, you have lots of numbers about, you know, how much you need. And I think one of the first things we must realize is that the estimates of need are simply grotesquely out of line with anything that's likely to come out of any of the institutional mechanisms that are being pursued at the moment. For example, I think you in the newspapers you have Jeff Sachs today saying that for developing countries, he says the poorest countries, and I think he means all developing countries except China, you need something of the order of $1 trillion a year. My guess is that's only for mitigation and not include adaptation. And you know, to put things in perspective, so far, the climate finance has talked about $100 billion a year, which they haven't yet achieved. The current assessment, based on various models, etc., that I've seen, is that India itself would need or should put in place something of the order of 100 plus billion per year. And the developing world, as Jeff Sachs says, is in the order of $1 trillion and maybe more. So, you know, this shows the huge amount that's needed. And I don't know whether, I mean, you gentlemen and ladies are all part of the various working groups which are hopefully feeding into the G20. And I have no idea whether the G20 thinks that it can actually somehow close this gap. But, you know, realistically, if the world wants to be serious, if the world wants to be taken seriously, it ought to come clean. And it should say that, look, we think the total need is so much. This is what you guys have to do yourself. This is what's going to come from the international community. And then within the international community, it could be either public or private. Now, unless we have that sort of an outline, we are quite frankly not even beginning to debate. And I mean, we're in a situation where the G20 finance ministers have set up a joint initiative by the US and India, set up a committee chaired by Larry Summers from the US side and N.K. Singh from our side, which is a very distinguished committee. It includes a lot of people, all the really knowledgeable people that you can think of. And they're supposed to submit a report by, I think, this April. In parallel, you have Mr. Ajay Banga, who's become almost certainly going to be elected president of the World Bank. I mean, he's not opposed at the moment. Technically, he will take office in April. So you've got a new management coming in. The G20 will presumably present the new management with some kind of a report. And I would say that, we shouldn't be overwhelmed by the issue of whether the response is up to the level required, because the level required is so huge that what would be reasonable to say is that, is this a reasonable response? So even if it's not up to the scale required, can it actually be reasonable? And, take India, for example. I think right now, the World Bank probably lends to India about $10 billion. For climate finance, India needs 100. Now, in my view, if the World Bank sort of adds another $2 or $3 billion of climate finance, that'll always be welcome, but it's really not worth worrying or talking about. If, on the other hand, it were to say that, look, I know you need much more, but we are planning on an extra $15 billion for India, then you're beginning to be serious. So I think the first question that all of you should address, particularly those who are feeding into the G20, is, do they agree that unless a sort of a credible scale of support internationally is identified, you're really not making any progress? Second, it's quite clear that the credible scale, the support, international support, is not just going to be public funds. I mean, in all the discussions, it's being seen as a combination of public and private flows. And government policies are consistent with that. I mean, the Indian government's policy does not say that all the investment necessary in the energy transition has to be in the public sector. Certainly the energy transition in, if you like, electrifying transport, except in the case of railways, doesn't have to be in the public sector. So you could, in principle, have private support. But the question then arises, under what circumstances can a reasonable flow come in? And, certainly in the energy case, the critical thing would be, is there a revenue model which makes private inflows credible? If there isn't a revenue model, you're not going to have any private inflows. And we're talking about scales way beyond what is currently going on. So I want to distinguish that in many of these statements, we can always take satisfaction that something has happened, and something will happen. I mean, the World Bank will lend more money, there'll be more private investment in these areas, etc. But on a scale of 1 to 10, which is needed, is what will happen equal to 1 or 2 or 8 or 10, or even 5 or 6? That's really the important thing that we need to focus on. That's just one point. That is what's going to be the scale of response. I think one of the issues, again, this is a controversial point. Many people, and I think Larry Summers himself at one point had said that, the World Bank should change its operational model. And Janet Yellen has also said so. I mean, that's the American view of what constitutes reform. Everybody in the developing country also says there must be reform, but they probably have different things in mind. So I won't speculate on that. But the critical thing, one of the critical things that Larry Summers has said, and since he is the co-chair of the G20 committee, it'll be interesting to see whether he sustains this point of view in the committee report or just abandons it. His view has been that the government, the World Bank should be financing global public goods and not the usual development activity. And that's a very controversial proposition, because for India, for example, it could mean that, over a period of 2 or 3 years, the bank simply withdraws from financing the usual development, but on the other hand, offers a much broader support in a selected aspect of development finance, which is the energy transition. So, from the global public goods point of view, it would be supporting the energy transition. From the Indian point of view, this would not be additional. All that's happening is assistance that was earlier going to one kind of activity switches to another kind of activity. So I think this is also an important question that has to be addressed. Linked to that is a statement that I think the new president nominated or designate Ajay Banga has said, that under no circumstances should the World Bank's credit rating be at all compromised. Now, that would imply that expansion in lending will be determined at a pace. Two things. One is that the expansion in lending would be determined at the pace at which the capital of the bank can. And I think it'll be very important to know what the committee recommends to the G20. Do they recommend that we should have a capital increase? If not now, then let's say within the next 2 or 3 years. And in the meantime, the bank tries to find whatever means it can to expand its lending. Related to that, by the way, is a somewhat different issue. And that different issue is that the bank could always, if you like, serve the G7 countries by getting countries together into some kind of what they call a just energy partnership, putting together a whole bunch of projects which will be financed only in part by the World Bank and in large part really by bilateral assistance. Now, there is a kind of desire on the part of the developed countries to switch away from multilateral lending to this kind of bilateral lending. I mean, the usual argument, it puts the national flag on the assistance. It enables them to claim that, look, we're doing something for climate. It probably enables them also to have a stronger voice in the kind of conditionalities that would be associated with such lending. It also enables them to introduce the degree of competitiveness in bidding for these projects. I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, many countries might say, well, we're willing to put up money, but you can't have, let's say, Chinese companies bidding because it's really our funding and we don't want them to be bidding for these projects. If you do that, then at one stroke, you knock off quite a lot of the competitive bids that you could get for constructing renewable energy. You could also have a more extreme version, which is the money is there, but it's tied to purchase from us. So it's sort of strictly bilateral, but is under an umbrella, of good things, climate change, etc. Some people might say, look, it can be competitive vis-a-vis us and every other developing country, or us and a selected group of countries. So there are many variants that could come up. So this is again a controversial issue. Would the developing countries be happy with that mechanism being the principal mechanism for expanding the flow of multilateral assistance? Because if you don't increase the capital of the World Bank, then it's unavoidable that you have to do that. Last point that I want to make relates to the whole issue of private finance. Now, there are two things here. I mean, one is, private finance can easily flow into things like, electric vehicles, because that's essentially the revenue model is there. People will assess what the likelihood is of that market expanding, and they'll invest or not invest depending on what they think. But when it comes to investing in renewable energy, and energy is actually purchased by the distribution companies, which in turn get the money from consumers. And certainly in India, all the distribution companies are financially, they don't use the word broke, but they are pretty close to being broke. So the question arises, will you get a significant amount of international investment backing expansion of renewable capacity in a world where basically the politicization of the electricity tariff ensures that you may not have a workable revenue model? If that's not feasible, then certainly the private sector, my guess is, will not be interested in investing. Some people think that this is where the World Bank can help by leveraging the investment. They do some investment, the private sector does some. But that will have to be linked with a lot of risk mitigation, in the sense that if if the money is not repaid, will the World Bank step in? Will the central government step in? I mean, these are difficult issues that need to be resolved. Central government. Point, I mean, I'm running out of time. One can go on and on. But my final point really relates to the scope for innovative financing. One sort of innovative financing relates to risk mitigation. And there you have project risk, you have sector risk, like, for example, the distribution company problem, and you have country risk, where people are just not sure whether the country will not go downhill, in which case you will have a massive depreciation of the currency, in which case the money won't come back. It's not clear how those kinds of risks can actually be de-risked. The term de-risking is frequently used in the discussion, and I'm never sure what exactly it means. If you ask people, I mean, right now, the argument until about a couple of days ago, or maybe a couple of weeks ago, it used to be the case that, look, interest rates in the short term are virtually zero, and it's a phenomenal opportunity to get money at low interest rates and use it to fund climate finance. I mean, they weren't zero at the longer end, but they were low. Now they're on the upward curve. But the fact is that in many of these cases, country risk can be as high as 10 percentage points. So, I mean, if the base rate, the sovereign rate is whatever, 3% or 4%, and you put in a little corporate risk element of another 2%, and then you add a country risk, which could be as high as 8 or 10%, then the cost of that capital is simply not going to be acceptable. I know that a lot of people will say that, look, we have access to green financing, which is very good. But the way I look at it is green financing reflects a supply side phenomenon of people with finance who, for some moral reason, prefer to accept a lower return, even though, I mean, if they're assured that the money is going to a green project. So you've got one set of problems. Who's going to determine that it's really going to a green project? That's a very big, institutional issue, because I don't know that there is any satisfactory way of doing it. But apart from that, apart from the issue of how you assure it, the preferential availability of this capital doesn't add up to more than a benefit of 50 basis points. So there are a lot of people willing to say that, look, other things being the same, I'm willing to take a return which is 50 basis points less if I'm assured that this is a green project. But that any country risk, any project risk, any sector risk will have to be covered over and above that. So while green financing will lower the cost, I don't think it can lower the cost more than what the suppliers of green finance are willing to accept as a lower return on their funds. These are some of the issues that I think we need to look at in order to get to a good sense of what is feasible and what are the constraints. But let me say, I don't expect all of them to be resolved. So I think a good outcome would be, we recognize these things and say, within the scope of what is available, what can we do in the next 5 years? And climate change is a long-term thing. If something works well for the next 5 years, we'll have enough time to do other things later on. So let me stop at this point, and thank you for listening so patiently.
Thank you. I think you've laid out the 4 important issues, especially seen from the Indian perspective. In fact, we had our first session last week where we didn't get that much of an Indian perspective. So I'm very happy that you laid it out. So let me, with that, turn to our second speaker, Dr. Frannie, who was here earlier, but perhaps some of the risk part, I think you You've done a lot of work on that, and I think that's an important issue. So maybe you can also touch on that. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Arvind, and it's great to see and hear Montek. It's been a while since I've heard from you, and thank you for inviting me once again, Professor Singh. Maybe first the question on climate finance and why it becomes an important issue for middle-income and low-income countries. First, because many of the issues related to climate risk are also development issues, and many development issues have a contribution to global public goods and the other way around. So I'll give 3 quick examples, and then I'll look then into how then do you pay for it, the finance side, and then the risk side. So looking first at the example of adaptation and mitigation, I really love the classification that Montek provided. I take the example of forests, whether it's reforestation, land restoration, or agroforestry. Many of these activities result in protect.
I think we got a break in the.
So we can wait for a minute or two, because
Okay.
last time also we saw that there was some problem at her net.
Should we go to?
The next speaker?
Let's see for a minute.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I think we had a problem last time also. So maybe if Dr. Panda is ready, Architesh, Dr. Panda, do you want to make your points while we wait?
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon from here. I want to share my screen, so just give me a sec. I think.
Okay, you have a screen share. Okay.
Yes, I think I will have some PowerPoint here.
Okay.
Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today, and I will just broadly discuss on some of the role of fiscal and monetary policy in climate finance. As we heard from Dr. Ahluwalia earlier, that it's a kind of a broad topic, and we are not really sure if we are talking about the India level or we are talking at the global level. And as we all know that both monetary and fiscal policy is really very vast topic to be covered even in 1 or 2 seminar and presentation. So I will start with some of the basics that has been told earlier, why we are talking about climate finance in the first place. As you all know that climate change is one of the biggest problem, and I would like to refute the statement that it's not really a long-term phenomenon anymore. It's really been there on our front right now. And you can see from the slide here that also earlier pointed that climate finance is a big topic, and we really need a lot of finance. And as you can see from the graph here, if we want to really quickly reach net zero by 2050 or try to control climate change below 1.5 degrees, we really need some $6 trillion of investment by 2050. And looking at the current investment, which is really less than $1 billion at the global level, I think there is a strong need to push for both fiscal tools and monetary tools, not only at the global level, but also at the national level and most of the low-income countries and middle-income countries. So that's the background why we're talking about climate finance and the fiscal and monetary policies. So yeah, from the last 2 or 3 decades, I think we have been talking about this environmental tax reforms. And as you can see from the slide here, that this is just a description of how really changing the tax structure at the national level is really important to reach the climate target and have some adequate climate finance at hand. And there has been different argument in favor of environmental tax reforms, where we are talking that the tax on carbon budget or carbon tax is really low at the global level. And environmental tax reforms really combines this both component of good tax structure and also taking into account the environment. the impacts of climate change and how we structure the fiscal design at the national level. So we can really both look into mitigation of climate change as well as the adaptation of climate change. In the right-hand side graph, I've just tried to show you why the externalities that has I earlier pointed out that it's a public good, right? It's a climate change, a public good, and there is no control and there is a lot of externalities. So if you look at the environmental tax gap at the global level for the fossil fuel, you can see that for most of the low-income countries, there is a large externalities in the right-hand side graph, which has not been taken into account, which basically means that the tax is really very less for the fiscal policies in most of the low and middle-income countries. Now, moving to the third point that I talked earlier on fiscal policies and climate change, if we really want to contain global climate change by 1.5 degree before 2015, the tax really has to go, carbon prices really has to go around somewhere around 25 to 30 dollar per ton of CO2 by 2030. But currently the global carbon price is only $2, which is like far below what is the planet needs to, have the remove climate change. But if you can see from the slide here also that when you are talking about tax structure, it is also important to talk about redistribution, because when you are increasing the carbon tax, as has been done in most of the developed world, we have to look into the distribution impact. For example, if you raise the tax in India, the carbon tax, let's say that the electricity bill at the household level will go up by 43% cumulatively over the next decade on average. So that's the kind of distributional impact we need to be careful about when we are talking about the tax structure or the fiscal structure at the national level, which has been shown in the right-hand side graph. You can see that the tax gap, environmental tax gap, for example, for coal, which is quite large for the low and middle income countries. For also, you can see that India is in red graph, which basically means that the tax gap is quite large for India as well. So this is kind of the role of tax that we can have an impact on climate finance and fiscal policies. And the next point that I want to talk is that we also know that the voluntary carbon market has been there quite for some time now, but it is quite limited to a few countries. For example, in the case of Asia, China is really doing a lot now in terms of voluntary carbon markets. For the case of India, we have just started, and the voluntary carbon market is expected to be come into force by July this year in India. And there is a scheme called Perform, Achieve and Trade scheme, which is kind of mandatory energy efficiency scheme covering more than 1,000 entities. So here in this slide, I want to explain that if we want to reach net zero, which is basically means reducing greenhouse gas atmosphere by 2050, at least we need to have $25 per ton of CO2, which is shown in the left-hand side graph. As you can see that if the tax rate can be raised to $25 per ton of CO2 of carbon tax, we are most likely to achieve the target of 1.5 degree, but which is not really happening right now. Now, another important point I want to focus here is the fiscal sustainability. We have been talking about that if you're talking about climate finance, we know that we need a lot of finance, at least to the low-income countries. But in the long term, what this means is basically that we have to divert a lot of amount of money from other sectors of the economy towards the financing the climate change or other things. But as you can see from the left-hand side graph here, that most of the highly vulnerable countries are also in the high debt. And on the left-hand corner, I have shown a graph from Tonga, which is a country which was devastated by cyclone last year. If you look at the graph, there is a case that the high indebtedness of the country was just in 1 year or one cyclone. So for most of the vulnerable countries, it is not only about tax rate; it's also about how they're adapting to the impacts of climate change, how the post-disaster reconstruction is happening, and how the fiscal policy and how the fiscal sustainability at the country level is going to happen. So in this case, I think we also need to look into climate change and long-term fiscal sustainability. So this is just an example to talk about fiscal sustainability. And just to touch a brief about India, as you know, we all know that there has been a lot of schemes now at the all India level. We're talking about different finance commissions, and they have been trying to make some reforms at the national level on how to talk about climate change. And you see that there is a lot of changes has been happening. Like, for example, we have this National Disaster Response Mitigation Fund, National State Disaster Mitigation Fund, and other innovations. But most recently now what we are talking about is that we really need to take into account the fiscal impacts or monetary impact at the budget level. And some few states have already started to take into account the sustainable development goal and how to allocate money into the national or the state budgeting. I will give you two examples here, like for example, the state of Haryana and the state of Odisha. They have already started taking into account the sustainable development goals, which is climate change is one big part in there. And they are trying to allocate different kind of money to the environmental aspects like life on land, life on earth, and these things, etc. But at the same time, if you look at the data, environmental protection makes less than 0% of total, makes up to 1% of the total subnational government expenditure in India, which means we are still really at the low level in terms of public expenditure for climate change, which needs to go up in the coming years. And the question arises here is how do we incentivize this subnational government to spend more on decarbonization? Maybe intergovernmental fiscal transfer can be something which suits the financial instruments at the all India level. And also India is one of the first country to start with this, what is called the India's equalization grant or tax revenue, which started in 2014, which created the world's first ecological fiscal transfer for forest cover. But the outcome is not really, I don't know what's happening with the outcome, but we still need some more monitoring and evaluation. Now coming to the monetary policy, I think earlier it was mentioned that along with fiscal policy, monetary policy is really important. And we also know that, for example, in the case of India, Reserve Bank of India is one of the central bank which controls almost all the monetary policy in the country. And we also need to think how the central banking system, not only at the developing countries, but also in the case of India, how they are thinking about the physical risks. For example, what will happen to if India is going to face large floods or droughts or cyclones, what is going to happen for the physical risks. And the second component is the transition risk, which basically means that in the process of moving towards a decarbonized society for net zero transition in India, what kind of things that the transition risk the central bank should think. And you can see that there are different examples, like we can talk about extreme events, we can talk about slow event, and how we are going to adjust the interest rate, how we are going to adjust the transition process. So we have to take into account both the physical risk and transition risk when we're talking about monetary policy. But at the current state, I think in the case of India, at least most of the private companies, most of the public sector companies, they're not really thinking very seriously about climate change, although there has been some movement in that. But one might ask, what is the link between climate change and monetary policy? You can see, look at the right-hand side graph where from one of the recent studies, they have tried to establish how climate change is, like hot summer weather is really impacting the inflation in low-income countries and high-income countries. They found that there is a clear non-negligible link between inflation and weather shocks, for example, during the hot summer when the food supply is less. So we really need to think about how the monetary policy at the Indian level is going to transform and how we're going to deal with this climate change at the policy level. Now, this is a simple graph where I have tried to show what kind of monetary policy that can happen at the India level. And I also try to show that we can either react to climate change, we can raise awareness to climate change, or we can proactively mitigate climate change. There has been different instruments that has been talked through at the global level right now. I just want to touch upon three things that we have in the last 5 years being the first one is Network for Greening the Financial System, which India is also a member. The second one is the Task Force on Climate-related Disclosures, where private companies are really need to disclose what kind of investment they're making and how they're aligned to the impacts of climate change and how they're suggesting it. The third one is the environmental, social, and governance policy, which is also very important. And as you can see from the graph, from the slide, that there are many kind of steps that can be taken at the central level, also the state level. For example, creating awareness on climate risk, and for example, publicly communicate things towards the public, what's happening at the monetary level. For this to happen, I think central bank really plays a great role in this aspect, and they really need to take care of this impacts of climate change on their policies. And lastly, I just want to focus on a recent concept, which is called climate change stress testing, which has happened in many countries right now. For example, France, UK, and Hong Kong, Australia. What they're trying to do here is they're trying to test the level of stress that the central banks can take, or how much stability they can maintain in terms of monetary policy in the face of climate change impact. So this is this is called the climate change stress test, which is slowly now starting to happen in India at this moment. We are not yet there, but we are preparing for it. I think this year and last year, RBI has already produced one guidelines for the for the banks and private companies how to do the stress testing for their at the subnational level. And this also shows that, as you can see from the slide here, that a few of the Indian banks have attempted to quantify their climate risk exposure, and only a third have assigned board-level responsibility for climate initiative, which means basically that we are not really seriously thinking about climate change or impact of climate change at the monetary policy level. And also, this is quite new for India, so I hope that we are going to do it in the coming years and try to see how, at the policy level, the central bank is going to really take the stress of climate change and maintain the stability of the banks. So I think I will stop here, and questions are welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dr. Frannie was just back. I don't know whether she's gone again. There you are. So you can resume. I guess we substituted, you got cut off. So please resume. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Arvind. I don't know where I got cut off, but I just noticed that I was muted, and it was not me who muted the microphone. So I'll maybe catch up from where I thought I ended. So I was talking about, for developing and middle-income countries, the trade-off between global public goods and development issues, which are local, is quite thin because they are usually interrelated. And I gave the example of forests, the example of floods in cities, and I was talking about the example of droughts. And if you have an insurance instrument, for example, that insures farmers during droughts and it works across multiple countries, it turns a local issue with a global climate risk into a local global issue. So to me, the argument of whether MDBs should finance development or climate for the majority of countries becomes a theoretical issue when those kind of issues come to the development discussion. And therefore, in order to support availability of development financing, I think it's important to keep arguing in those areas where global public goods and local development needs interface. The second point I wanted to make is then, where will the capital come from? Because the development agenda is still huge and requires financing, but then climate risks raise the requirements for financing very high. So there are three potential sources of funding. The first one is own capital and the development finance institutions in general. This is higher for those that have private sector portfolios because they've been earning income from those in terms of the repayments to the private transactions that they've been financing. So IFC is an example, EBRD is an example, but the other MDBs that don't have very substantial private sector portfolios, they rely on capital replenishments in order to be able to do more. So we looked at a second category of where they could actually raise what they do without necessarily requiring additional capital. And that went into looking at efficiency and how they could use risk transfers more effectively, but at the same time also attract private investment through different forms of non-voting capital, including hybrid capital. So let's start with the risk transfer side. These are transactions that have been successfully done by some MDBs. If you look at the African Development Bank, they did a program called Room to Run, which allowed institutional investors and others to take risk in Africa, in African portfolios, and that released capital for the African development to do more. And this example can be replicated in other MDBs with an opportunity to scale up what the MDBs can do. Other examples of risk transfer that go beyond the portfolio level are using innovations such as an insurance product that uses callable capital as a way to provide contingent financing to a particular portfolio. This has been done, again, I'm using the example of the African Development Bank, with the UK using its allocations of callable capital to secure the financing. A third example is where entire crowding in of private investors was possible, because you could create a securitized asset that then the private sector is interested in financing, and other forms of hybrid capital that crowd in private financing. So that's another pathway, which I think, Montek, you referred to as innovation. So we have a whole chapter in our report called Innovations in Financing the Capital Adequacy Needs of the MDBs. But the last recommendations that we had would really change in a huge scale the amount of capital available to the MDBs. And the first one has to do with the way in which MDBs define their risk appetite, which is defined by the shareholders on behalf of the MDBs, and also the way in which credit rating agencies treat the preferred creditor status that MDBs enjoy, and also how they treat callable capital. When you look at the potential for those two recommendations to generate more financing, it's orders of magnitudes higher than what MDBs could do by using innovation alone. The examples there, we have the Inter-American Development Bank that has already used a portion of its callable capital to raise tremendously the risk appetite that they have, and therefore the lending capacity that they have. And we believe this can be replicated in other MDBs. Likewise, when you look at the redefinition of risk appetite, when you look at entities like IDB Invest, which is the private arm of IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, they have been able to redefine their risk appetite, make their capital adequacy framework risk sensitive, and as a result, increase tremendously the amount of financing that is available to lend to their client countries. The third aspect which I wanted to mention has more to do then with how the cost of capital that would then be borne by the borrowers, because the MDBs are using more market instruments, can be brought down through other innovations that we are able to uncover. And the first one is using philanthropic capital and grant financing to buy down the cost of capital. These are examples that have been used in other areas. So if you take, I gave last time the example of polio eradication, where the Gates Foundation worked with the Islamic Development Bank to bring huge amounts more of capital to, in this case, it was Pakistan, to eradicate polio in a way that neither Pakistan could have afforded to borrow that amount of money for polio eradication, nor could the Islamic Development Bank afford the concentration of risk if they were to lend such a high amount to a single obligor. So these solutions can allow extension on both ends, the country borrowing capacity and the cost of capital for the country, but also the MDB risk concentration and the ability to stretch what capital they have to more countries. This example could be used for flooding, it could be used for forest fires, it could be used for drought and other climate-related risks. The last area I wanted to mention has to do with the layering from multilateral development banks, regional development banks, and national development banks. Because almost all countries have national development banks. They are more structured to address local or domestic issues. And in that structuring, therefore, they can layer with other MDBs and regional development banks to bring the gap, or to fill the gap in the financing needed for both development and climate-related risks, and also for dealing with global public goods or bads like the pandemic that we have just been handling across all the countries. There are some examples there. I'll take the case of the Rwanda Development Bank that was able to work with the European Investment Bank and the Agence Française de Développement to combine the resources they had at the national level with bilateral and multilateral financing to strengthen and broaden the footprint that they have for the energy transition. So this is one way in which the just energy transition can be financed country by country by negotiating these packages that bring in bilateral and multilateral aid to support the national development banks. And the advantage of this structure is it could actually give huge opportunities then for the private sector to also come into those transactions. So I will close by saying that there is a huge opportunity for, first of all, blending mitigation and adaptation solutions in a way that address both development objectives and climate objectives along with global public goods, with the examples of forests, floods, and droughts. That's just a few examples, but I think if we look deeper, we can find other ways to do that. Secondly, there is a way to layer national development banks with regional banks and MDBs to deliver a bigger result for a country than if each of them are working alone. And that could also be a solution to crowd in bilateral financing. And third, the MDBs themselves can do more by looking at the way in which they define risk appetite, the way they use callable capital, and how they then can expand the envelope that they have without necessarily needing injections of new capital. And then the last area I will mention, and this is particularly relevant for India, is to see how MDBs can accompany middle-income countries like India when they go to the market. Because when India goes to the market with its current credit rating and its current exposure, the rates, the pricing that it faces is quite steep compared to, say, concessional finance. But if it were to be taken to the market by an MDB that also gives part of its AAA rating to lend it for the purposes of accompanying a middle-income sovereign to the market, that could give better rates in the market. We have examples of this in East Africa, where the Trade and Development Bank was able to raise financing for countries like Kenya and Tanzania, and that allowed those countries then to get better rates than if they had gone to the market alone. And the issue then is, what if that can be done then at the level of the AAA rated MDBs who have much deeper capabilities to support more countries? And on the AAA issue, and I'd like to really piggyback on what Montek had said about the need for the MDBs to maintain AAA so that they can borrow at cheaper rates. We conclude in our report that the AAA rating should be used as a tool and not as an objective, because that allows the MDBs to take it as a tool that they use to get cheaper financing. But then once in a while, they may fall short of the AAA rating, and they can use other techniques to boost their rating so that the credit rating agencies don't drag them down. Examples of how you do that: you can insure the callable capital of weaker rated sovereigns who make up part of your shareholding structure, and rating agencies recognize then the insured rating rather than the original sovereign rating, and that gives you an uplift in the credit ratings for the MDB. You could insure particular risk portfolios and reduce concentration risk, and that is also recognized by the credit rating agencies. And there are other techniques as well. In the interest of time, I won't go through all of them, but the principle is that MDBs could basically manage to have AAA as a tool rather than an objective, and then use other techniques to make sure they get the uplift and don't necessarily lose their AAA rating. But if they hold AAA as an objective, it means they will never bump up against that limit, and therefore they will do less than what they are capable of doing if they would use other innovations to de-risk, to transfer risk, or to ensure and secure riskier shareholder capital. So I'll stop here, Arvind, and hand over back to you. And thank you once again for inviting me.
Thank you. I think you've given a whole bunch of ideas for risk reduction, which are, I think, very useful. So let's turn to our last speaker before we initiate the discussion. That's Neha. Yeah.
Yes. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes. So good evening, and thank you for this opportunity. And a lot, Frannie, you have covered, and Mr. Ahluwalia and his opening remarks covered. You basically asked the big question where the capital will come from. I had that as my highlight heading to begin with. I will try to add something from my perspective and from the world that I come from, which is sustainable finance world. And Mr. Ahluwalia talked about private finance and asked us to actually take a realistic look at what we are talking about in terms of augmenting finance, the sources of financing, and recalibrating finance. And a sense check is definitely good right in the beginning. So coming to a sense check of private capital, private finance, you know, despite holding nearly $379 trillion, I mean, that's the figure I have right in front of my eyes, of the world's finance assets, the private sector, it was responsible for just half of the 850 billion in global climate finance flows. So that's how much private sector is actually contributing to climate finance flows. That said, you know, there is no longer really too much of a debate, you know, around the commercial attractiveness of clean investments. We know that at least for the renewable energy sector, it is awash with capital. The growth of investments in clean energy, I think they soared to around 12% since 2020. And growth in solar was even more impressive at about 33%. But the disturbing trend has been that a lot of it happened within the developed economies. The global figures on clean energy investments in emerging market and developing economies actually declined by at least about $10 billion from 73 to 63 billion between 2018 to 21. So these are numbers, and so all kinds of numbers flow around, as Mr. Ahluwalia, you know, began with saying that. But this is the case of private finance, part of the flow of climate finance to the private sector. But it is important because, like you mentioned, Frannie, that the climate risks, the physical impacts of it, the chronic and the transition impacts of it will actually shave off percentage points of GDPs of countries. And yet the fiscal capacity and the availability of capital will differ hugely between developed economies and developing economies. So I would focus my comments on the theme of this topic, which is the fiscal and monetary policy. So basically, both of these instruments, you know, they're about securing resources for growth and development, securing desired distributive outcomes, and maintaining macroeconomic stability. So I will focus it on the first two objectives, which is, you know, resources for growth and development and securing the desired outcomes. So there's a climate equity aspect of it that I would really like us to focus on as well. So the key aspect, actually, the sustainable finance ecosystem is transparency on spending. This is the main difference between business as usual, or what we might call finance as usual, and finance for sustainable economic activities. And here, the world of thematic debt capital, I will just tell you what it, you know, stands for the wider audience. That actually offers a huge opportunity to governments. So thematic debt capital, you know, we talked about green bonds, ESG bonds, pandemic bonds. So there's a whole lot of themes that these debt capital instruments, they are beginning to finance. Now, you talked about the rating, Frannie, about countries like India and what they can come into the market with, and sovereign issuances or governments actually tapping this market. It has been sort of a late phenomenon. I mean, the global thematic capital started surging. I mean, it's been a short history, but still 10 years or so. Sovereigns started coming to this market a little bit later. But they are dipping into this market because it can provide them long-dated funding. It is particularly well suited to the infrastructure and other long-term capital investments needed for transition. And this allows governments to leverage private finance to overcome the huge financing gap that we have just heard of. And the proceeds that you raise as part of this thematic bond instruments, green bonds, etc., you can fund the expenditures linked to policy measures such as grants, subsidies, and tax credits, and other activities which clearly fall within these green definitions. And the idea of transparency is actually supreme over here, and it also involves budget tagging of such eligible expenditure. Now, but there's also been some kind of a debate about the fact that earmarking the use of proceeds versus fungibility is an important sort of a discourse which has been happening. So we know that both taxes and debt, they are fungible across government spending heads. So which is a hallmark feature of public finance. And fiscal economists, they keep on asserting that actually all earmarking is purely optical, But in the case of sovereign green bonds, the purposes for which such proceeds can be used are restricted. So if such bonds are issued by sovereign as opposed to public sector enterprises, this can be perceived as a limiting feature. But finance ministries and in many of these countries, they actually are coming into this market because they welcome the specificity of expenditure associated with green bonds, because it enhances their ability to ensure that money is spent for the purposes intended. Another thing which is quite interesting with these instruments is that they facilitate quantification of sovereign fiscal commitment to green and sustainable activities. And of course, green sovereign bonds, they also, broaden and they deepen the market for sovereign debt. And we just had the Indian sovereign green bond issued in early this year in January. And it was a fantastic sort of a starting point for India. It was INR denominated, it was domestic currency and onshore. And the success of the debut showed that the INR denominated green bonds are attractive to foreign investors. And there is also, it also signaled that there is ample appetite within the government of India to come with repeat issuances of sovereign green bonds, consistent, of course, to the overall fiscal prudence. So that aspect, this transparency aspect, Mr. Ahluwalia, seems to be rather a much more impressive feature rather than, those 50 basis points or 70 basis points of green evergreen premium that we might be associating with in some cases. This is not a regular feature, even in the case of sovereign green bonds, but it makes these products attractive from the vantage of fiscal policy. So in a way, it's a good strategy because, it diversifies your investor pool, it creates the positive socioeconomic and environmental outcomes, and it helps governments finance their public commitments to Paris and SDG targets. The other part of fiscal policy that I would like to touch upon, and I will conclude my points over here, but I could add in the other round on the role of central banks, because that's an important one too, but limiting myself to the fiscal policy aspects of it. Reorientation of capital flows using fiscal policy instruments like subsidies and taxes, that can play a huge role in climate financing. But at the same time, we have to be cognizant of the fact that this transition will also incur revenue losses as you shift away from carbon intensive activities, and will impact public finances. So if you just to give you a little bit of an example from India's case, if we have to achieve our SDG targets and we have to keep on this will require revenue raising measures. And the tax revenues right now from fossil fuels, they account for close to a fifth of our tax revenues. So India's budgetary receipts are linked to fossil fuel consumption in a very, very big way. These revenues, they also underpin in a country like India, the fiscal autonomy and sufficiency of state and central governments. As you know, India collects these taxes at multiple levels between states and center on coal, oil, and natural gas. So this will be an important aspect to look into. Not only will these losses be of a significant substantial quantum, but they will also be spatially uneven, and still on the India's case especially. Some states will get more fiscally impacted while the other states will not, and that is because of their linkage perhaps on the coal kind of economy which they depend upon. Then the annual revenue gap will also, of course, depend on the design of the pathway, that you will take, say, to phase down your carbon intensive activities. But whichever way you look at it, there will be a reasonable amount of loss unless the economic activity from clean technology options can replace the tax base. So there would, net, there would be a shortfall given the time span that we are talking about. So and then if you're saying that you have to really do it at the pace that it is required to be done, then you will have to create fiscal space and better planning to incentivize these the cleaner investment in cleaner technologies. At the same time, again, you will have to see that, weak public finances, if you're not planning properly, they will make it costly to borrow. They will put a pressure on currency, and, where fiscal strains will erode confidence of private finance. So public finance and private finance are pretty intricately linked when we're talking about increasing the pace and scale of climate finance. They will also, when you come to subsidies, I don't think they are going to be scaled down. Rather, I think maybe the composition will change, but they will need to be funneled to supporting the renewables. So that aspect will be a huge part of our public finance considerations. They will also probably have to take care of things like income support will be needed. That measures may also be necessary. So those kind of things we will have to keep we'll have to take into account when it comes to fiscal policy measures. But interestingly, some countries, they are giving, say, interest rate subsidies to, say, green bond issuers, right? So the stamp duty is exempted, that can be applied to green bond issuance. So if you're looking at augmenting the source of finance and private finance, and through these thematic instruments, the subsidies can be a part of that structure also. The other thing that I need to really make a point over here is that the verification, and Mr. Ahluwalia made this in the beginning also, that how green is important, which means that there needs to be external verification, which means there are additional costs to this verification. So large issuers, sovereign issuers, it's okay, but that kind of also, at least it is becoming a norm, but it is not yet a norm. Governments do feel that, okay, if I am the government, if I'm the sovereign, why do I need to verify what I'm doing? But it is critical aspect of the sustainable finance world that is actually growing very fast. I think it stands at around $3.5 trillion in thematic debt globally, and it is one of those instruments that has been growing so fast that the climate investments rooted through this instrument are actually making a difference in terms of raising private finance. So Mr. Panda talked about carbon pricing. I'm not too sort of convinced about this mere obsession about this measure as being the panacea. For the carbon price to encourage clean investment, it must be high enough to prompt action, but it needs also to be stable. And carbon price volatility will discourage green investment. And particularly for emerging economies, I think that the carbon pricing may not be the appropriate tool as the main element of the policy package due to, greater political economy restraints. In fact, non-pricing instruments such as standards, regulations, and subsidies that I talked about, they can perhaps be more effective in overcoming the market failures and in developing infrastructure and augmenting climate finance. So, because these kind of non-pricing measures, citizens, the cost to citizens are less visible and less aggressive than pricing. So, an exclusive focus, I think, on carbon pricing that can actually delay the deployment of other climate mitigation action, increasing the cost of transition. So, another thing that probably we can talk about, and I will stop there, is how developed countries, especially EU, and are going to are thinking of putting carbon border adjustment mechanisms. So that will also again impact developing countries' exports. One idea that I heard from Mr. Panda is that in any of such measures, how the proceeds are redistributed to support the transition in developing countries would be important. And this is important again from the equity point of view, which I wanted to bring on the table, because the disruptions and dislocations will happen simultaneously in multiple sectors. So efforts to decarbonize will have to accommodate the rising consumption needs of people in the developing economies. You will need to be able to see that they create job opportunities, they enhance the affordable access to goods and services. So equity, if you can probably just look at it from the point of view of at least three stakeholder groups to my mind: the workers, the consumers, and the communities. So there will be demand for new skills, income support will be needed, financial aid will be needed as the transition gets underway. So this will also demand very, very deft management of this fiscal space. You already touched upon actually the underappreciated and underutilized national development banks, but I think you make a very, very important point, Frannie. I think this is something that we should think about. In fact, our newest infrastructure development bank, which is the National Development Bank for Infrastructure Development, NAPFID, that has just become operational, and but this will again depend upon how much it has as in the form of capitalization. So it has a corpus of 20,000 crores. It is planning to use that corpus to crowd in private capital and multiply that to about 110 lakh crores. I don't know how much of that is in USD, but yeah. So I'll stop there. I will stop there right now, and probably on the climate risk, I can come in if we have time. That is also important. Yeah.
I don't think we'll have much time for that, but I want to call Manjeet Puri first. Last time I had to keep you waiting, but sometimes listening to these things, I get the feeling that a free lunch. I'm glad the previous speaker mentioned the EU carbon tax, border tax. It seems like everybody wants to put the onus and the cost on somebody else. So maybe you'll take up that issue, Mr. Puri.
Dr. Virmani, thank you very much. And sir, I was privileged to have participated last time too. And basically, I'll try and reiterate the same point. I listened to all the presentation. I'm very honored that we have Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia here. He served on the high-level committee on climate finance following Copenhagen. So, we have a real expert among us, and I'm not saying the others are not. But I want to really thank Dr. Leautier for bringing up some very interesting issues. Callable capital definition and how to use it. The issue of the MDBs stepping forward. And I don't want to say much about India and, the issues here about having a development bank. Dr. Virmani, you would remember last time you mentioned how there are some amongst the people today who are calling back for, let me say, taking back the steps that we did earlier, converting the development banks into normal banks, which is what has happened. I'll leave that out. I want to make two simple, straightforward points. One is domestically, you need taxonomy. That I think is a particularly important thing. And let's try and get this taxonomy thing across and get it done. After that, what are the policy measures you want to take? Subsidies, you want to somehow help people, make it a corporate rule, this, that, whatever it is, good ideas. I'm not wanting to get into that. The second thing I want to say is the role of the private sector is going to be critical. And I want to say in developing countries, especially large developing countries, there isn't the ability to do what is required in climate. And I'm sorry for all those examples of pandemics and AIDS, etc. It pales into insignificance as compared to this. It is not possible to do without huge scale private sector movements. And private sector movements within the developing economies, India included, is not possible by itself. You have to have shifts of private money being invested in developing countries. These projects ab initio, they need to have their own profitability, but the cost of this capital has to come down. And so one very small but significant aspect of things that I would stress is finding some ways of assisting investments from the developed world into the developing world, private investments in terms of hedging and what can be done on that. I believe a large-scale institutional arrangement at the MDBs is possible one way forward. I'm not saying it's the only way forward. It is certainly one thing that can be done. And in fact, if structured sensibly and if it works pretty well as a theoretical model, pooling in large amounts of capital and large amounts of currencies, it can work sort of akin to an insurance product, in fact, become self-sustaining, with capital backup from the developed countries being in terms of capital, being in terms of callable capital. This is the real most important points that I just want to make, because this discussion is for others. The role of private capital, the role of foreign private capital from the developed world to the developing countries, and the importance of taxonomies. I'll leave it at that. I've been very enriched by these two webinars. Thank you very much to EGROW.
Thank you. I believe Professor Pandey is there also. Would you like to say something? Alok Pandey, Professor Alok Pandey.
Yes.
Okay, Dr.
Yes.
Kurian,
Yes.
Is Dr. Pandey there? Yeah.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I'm here. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me.
Oh, yeah. I can see you. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
So, it's a pleasure hearing this. In fact, this morning itself, I was speaking in a summit organized by NABARD on how to manage the climate change and the related areas in UP, in the state of UP. And the key idea for worry was that in UP being a very large state, huge population, we have somewhere, the biggest impact of climate change. We are somewhere like look at Pakistan. When climate change happens and flooding happens in Pakistan, even in US, this time I'm sitting in Chandigarh right now, and I think last week in Fazilka there was a tornado which was very similar to what came in Mississippi in US, and they say that it's all due to climate change. So we are the worst affected, especially and this time the unseasonal rains, they are also being given. But the key issue which remains is that the entire story of improving the state of affairs is more of a lip service in India. Now, in 2021 in COP26, we had promised that we would decarbonize at a big rate. Our net zero, the target was set at 2070. We had said that, India has almost 58% of its energy needs fulfilled by the coal-based sectors. China, we are very similar to what China is. And we had said that we'll decarbonize very fast. Now, the facts are actually opposite to it. In 2022, because of huge power crisis, we reopened 100 coal blocks. If you remember, in 2022 itself, the idea was that we reopened 100 coal mines. The fact is that we still are far away from where we should be. Now, again, another issue was that 2021 was the year when the decarbonization rate was the slowest. This was the global carbon intensity fell by 0.5% in 2021. It fell by an average of 1.4% per annum from 2000 to 2021. Now, to limit the warming to 2 degrees centigrade globally, we need to annually decarbonize at a rate of 6.3%. to limit it to 1.5 degrees centigrade, we need an annual decarbonization of 15.2%. And for that, what we need to do is to scale up the climate technologies, the technologies which basically help decarbonize by 6 to 14 times. These are the key climate technologies: the wind, solar power, and battery car sales. Now, what I've been witnessing that over the years, the governments have promised a lot, but they come to a point, they raise money through green bonds, and they put all the responsibility on the financer, whether it is the private sector. I was hearing Ms. Neha, Kumar, and other people. The entire responsibility of managing this fund, which will be given, which is collected through green bonds, is routed through financial institutions, on the financial institution itself. And that's where the catch lies. A lot of people borrow and they're not actually doing green work. So the fact is, this is something which requires fair amount of investment. In India, especially, the scaling up of technologies, we are nowhere when it comes to around 20% through renewable sources, for 20 to 40%. 60% is almost coal. So what I mean to say here is that this was a great discussion which we heard. But the key issue, once again, is whether the governments actually are becoming part of it. We do not see enough from the government side, both on fiscal as well as monetary side. We do not have the space anyhow, as far as fiscal side is concerned, or even the monetary side is concerned. We do not have the space anymore for them. So the key questions still remain. How do we provide funds for scaling up 6 to 14 times? I'll give you example of UP. The electric vehicle targets, even, the way lip service goes, the electric vehicles are taxed much higher than usual. The solar cells, if you remember, sir, earlier they were, financing this entire thing through something like, 3 basic accelerated depreciation method, viability gap funding, and generation-based incentives. Even there, the incentives were withdrawn in several budgets, which was given to them. So, my only view is that largely the whole idea of climate change in India from the government side is merely a lip service. The government withdraws itself and puts the onus on the financer, which is the financial institution. And I think we have a long way to go. But thank you, sir. This was an enabling session. We really look forward to very serious fiscal incentives under the very tight scenarios we have. Otherwise, I don't think we'll be able to manage the targets we have fixed for ourselves.
So I'm sorry, but I have to correct some impressions you have. I know for a fact that the auction, now the auctions for delivered power, they are all going to solar. So solar is completely competitive in terms of just delivered power. And there have been no new, in all those auctions, the solar, nobody has bid on the basis of coal. So if you just look at the delivered power, the solar is competitive without any subsidy. The problem is in storage. And that's where I'm sorry to say there's a lot of hand waving that somehow storage costs will go down by 10 times, 20 times, 100 times over the next 10 years. But without storage, there's a point beyond which you cannot raise the share of solar because you have to store it. You can't use it. If in the middle of the day there's a huge amount of solar power, you can't keep it hanging around. You have to store it. So the storage cost is going to be critical. That is going to be the key thing 5 years down the road. The second point is that in terms of EVs, I am not aware at all that EVs are being taxed at a higher rate than any other car. My impression is that there are subsidies on EVs and some of these may have been withdrawn, but there is absolutely no evidence that EVs are being taxed at a higher rate than ordinary cars. If subsidies have been withdrawn, that is possible. If some states gave some extra subsidies and withdrew them, I am not aware of the whole picture, but we shouldn't get this distortion that somehow we are moving in the wrong direction. That is not true. The third point I'm forced then to submit because of the points that have been made. We are heavily dependent on oil taxes, okay, on energy taxes already. So when people talk about putting carbon taxes, it's just a substitute. I think Neha ji pointed out that it will substitute. Actually, the states are heavily dependent, the center is heavily dependent on these, and it's very easy to say that we should have more carbon taxes, but you'll have to substitute. What what about all the stuff which is being done by using these taxes? You know, you can just call it a different tax, but it's still the same revenue. And that means you're going to withdraw this from something it's being used for and put into other areas. So we should be a little careful here. I'm not denying that maybe there is, the fourth point I would make is that pandemic is a very special thing. I think it's a wrong thing to take the pandemic events and extend them. Maybe some of them will be extended. I can't say for sure either way, but I think it's a serious mistake to take what has happened during the pandemic for various types of reasons, a lot of them. I mean, having written 5 papers in EGROW on the pandemic, it's the most unusual event in the country, in the world actually. So we have to be very careful about things which happened during the pandemic and saying somehow this is a new trend which is happening, whether it's in the country or somewhere else, positive or negative. You want to respond? Please go ahead.
No, I think, there's some kind of an idea, sir, which needs to be brought in, where, the scaling up of, in fact, the whole idea of funding and the innovation of funding. We need to now look into project financing as a major funding.
Okay, we've had a lot of discussion on that, and we are actually out of time. I'll give Dr. Kurian, who was there last time, also, please be very brief, because we've run out of time. Dr. Kurian.
Can I say something?
Dr. Kurian first, and then who
yes,
else?
Am I audible?
Montek after that, yeah.
I have 3 pointed questions. One is on monetary policy, the second on fiscal policy, and the third one is on private finance. So my anxiety is from 2008 onwards, the world is exposed to terrible financial instability, and we are now in its climax. So in this predicament, do you think that the central banks would give sufficient priority to climate finance? That is first query. The second query is, what about the viability of the old proposal of Tobin tax? And the third one is regarding private finance, especially Professor Neha referred to private finance. So again, my query is, we know the major polluters in the world are transnational corporations. They are private companies. How much is their share in climate finance? So these are my 3 very pointed questions. Thank you very much.
Montek, please go ahead. General, you might as well react to whatever you've heard.
No, I just want to, it's a very interesting discussion. I think Neha made the point that the government of India, green bonds issued it very well. My impression is of course it would have done very well. It's a sovereign bond. The real test of what that achieved is how much lower was the interest rate on the government of India sovereign green bond compared to the non-green sovereign bond. So when I said 50 basis points, I was implying that that's about as the maximum cheaper credit you can get.
Yeah.
So I think she's nodding her head, so that part remains valid. The government of India can raise whatever it wants, subject to whatever it feels its fiscal deficit should be. The problem really is that for the government to raise green bonds, it makes a lot of sense to raise green bonds to finance your own green investment. And there are several green investments that the government has to finance. Most importantly, the building of transmission infrastructure over a long period in order to absorb all this green power, which hopefully we'll get. But the government being able to raise green bonds doesn't help financing private guys unless you're going to give them government money, which is really not appropriate. There's some discussion, there was somebody who made the point that I think it was you who said that, Arvind, that all the kind of bids have been taken up by solar power. The fact is that the Solar Electricity Corporation is not able to offload these bids to distribution companies. So I think we're running into the limit. SECI did a very good job stepping in between to, as it were, take the payment risk, which is what they did. But I think there is no substitute for having a credible, financially viable distribution system. And, you know, we've had 4 separate efforts to make the distribution system viable. I was involved in 2 of the 4 failed efforts. So hopefully somebody else will do a better job. But that, I mean, that's a political, the issue is political. And I think unless we take care of that, you know, on the CBAMs and so on, I mean, let's face it, Europe is going to do that. And I think there's an issue here that a lot of people think we shouldn't, and you also seem to think that we shouldn't have carbon taxes. We should also have some kind of perform and trade kind of taxes. I mean, we do that. But you know, the PAT that we have got, the real question is, what is the equivalent carbon tax built around what we call our PAT limits? If that's very low, the mere fact that we have a perform and trade system doesn't actually satisfy anybody. So I think we will, one way or the other, and by the way, since you said that the government has huge fiscal constraints, many things it has to do, but you seem to feel that we must rule out carbon taxation. I mean, coal. I mean, we obviously, fossil fuels are heavily taxed. That is the other stuff.
Yeah.
Diesel. But coal is not heavily taxed at all. And the question is, how do you do this very politically difficult thing? Now, if you're saying we can't do that, then you must be able to find some other way of mobilizing the resources. Somebody suggested the Tobin tax. You know, that's like getting the world to tax itself in order to pay you. They're not going to do that. I mean, if we want the world to provide a transfer, we should negotiate a transfer and let them fund it whichever way they want. So I think we need to bring some realism into what we're talking about. Anyway, that's all I have to say.
No, those are both valid points. You know, one on sovereign, obviously, yeah, that's a very useful point because people tend to forget. I mean, we've deliberately kept away from sovereign borrowing. A few years ago, there was a move to have sovereign borrowings. The government seemed to announce it in the budget.
These are sovereign rupee bonds.
These are rupee bonds.
No problem if you have a fiscal constraint.
Right.
There's nothing wrong with raising sovereign bonds for the entire fiscal.
Right. So,
I mean, unless you are saying that sovereign green bonds should bust the fiscal limit.
No, I am just supporting you. Let me just finish, Montek.
I'm clarifying because otherwise you're kind of.
So the thing to compare is like with like. So if it's a green bond, exactly your point. The question is how much you gain by calling it a green bond, you know, having exactly the same thing, whether it's in rupees or dollars or whatever, and borrowed by the same institution, how much you gain by labeling it and using it for green purposes. That's really the issue, which you rightly pointed out. Second, I completely agree. The key, you were on 2 committees. I chaired one, and I've been on many of those distribution. Total failure. I mean, I am also willingly admit that I think it was my last effort in the Planning Commission, the erstwhile Planning Commission, where I tried to solve this distribution problem and failed miserably. So yes, and since then, this government has gone through 2 or 3 phases of, you know, so without solving the distribution issue, really just raising the price of coal, whether it's a tax or anything, really doesn't matter because who's going to pay it? You know, it's from one pocket to the other, and then you go through all these contortions of lending through one agency to another, and whole system keeps going round and round. Yeah. So clearly, the distribution aspect is very important, and the states are very important. I mean, they are the key. I don't know. We've tried so many incentive things in the last, 3-4 budgets, different types of incentive schemes. So far, I don't think they've worked sufficiently. We'll all agree. Okay.
Hello, sir.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of the original speakers want to speak. We are running out of time. I think maybe Dr.
Hello, sir.
Just hold on. I'm going to give Dr. Nagavani
Sir.
a chance because she raised her hand, and then maybe the speakers can have a say. Yeah.
I think, sir, Professor Ashima Goel also wanted to ask something.
Yeah, but I saw Dr. Nagavani. Sorry, I'm not pronouncing your name properly, but go ahead. And then we'll come to Ashma. Dr. Kagalu, you wanted to ask something? No? Okay, let's go to Dr. Goyal. Ashma, you want to say something?
I just had a because there's very little time. So just a question directed to Frannie. All these discussion is really enriching. But for Frannie, I had these two questions. One is that there are very interesting examples of ways to expand capital. But what is the constraint on implementation, on really taking this up to make the material difference, as Montek was saying? And the second question is that, this cost of borrowing, very often that exchange rate risk is the main one raising cost for emerging markets. But that exchange rate risk is something like a catastrophe. There might be a sharp depreciation, but and so there is a huge interest premium, country risk premium charge, but it may not happen. So as the idea of some insurance product, just as you have reinsurance, so that and then some in a country cluster, some countries depreciate, some, and there is information on this. And again, some work I have done shows that actually the interest rate difference is much larger than actual exchange rate depreciation for most periods for most emerging markets. So therefore, can some kind of insurance product be designed to reduce the country risk premium?
Yeah.
Due to exchange.
Okay, so I think that maybe what I'm going to do is go backwards.
Sir, I have a doubt, sir.
I'm sorry that we have already gone 10 minutes over. I'm just going to give Neha, Kumar, then Dr. Panda, Dr. Frannie, and then Montek has the last word. Neha ji?
Yes, well, I do have a couple of points. Maybe I'll just make them quickly. The 2 points raised by Mr. Puri. One was that we would require international capital to flow in, and to that point, the requirement of a taxonomy is just hitting the nail on its head. What do these? What gets funded is actually remains a question. So having a taxonomy sorted out is one important thing, and I will agree with that. But to add to what he was saying, that yes, international capital, why that is good is because there is a clear demand from investors for these green products, okay? And that is the low-hanging fruit, and we need that capital to move into India. But without actually mobilizing this differentiation within the domestic markets, I don't think we can actually solve the capital availability problem and capital deployment problem. And in that sense, I will just conclude over here. The sovereign green bond is actually quite good because not only for the 50 basis points, 6 basis points of that, but actually the demonstration effects, Mr. Ahluwalia, after that issuance, I myself have gotten calls from not only public entities at the state level, at the municipal level, who are trying to enter into the domestic market, and they want to know how and what kind of advantages they will get, but also private entities. So the more issuers, when they come into this domestic capital market, that asset class tends to grow. And an example that comes to my mind is that when UK issued this sovereign green bond, that year itself, the corporate debt of green corporate green bonds actually increased by 79%. So the demonstration effects can be quite significant in that sense, and that should also help more private companies raise debt, and domestically is perhaps better in some ways, so that you don't get stuck in the external debt traps.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Mr. Panda.
Thank you. It's really very interesting discussion, and I have only a few points to make. I think there is some kind of reluctance that after 3 decades of liberalization, we are not really talking about aligning ourselves with the market mechanisms. Like for example, free market mechanism. We're talking about the poll tax and reducing them or increasing them. That's the first point. The second one, I think, in this very broad discussion of private and public capital, I think we are missing, what we are missing here is the sub-national level that's happening in India and the fiscal federalism that needs to take care of these things. And what kind of fiscal federalism do we have now in India, and what kind of things we can put in place to make this happening? That's the third one. And the last one is, as we all know, that private capital is really, we're talking about private capital and blended finance is also really important. But at the same time, I also think that government really has a big role to play. And I also mentioned earlier that we are not really anywhere near creating such kind of an environment where we talk about, fiscal and monetary policies to take care of the climate finance. So I think there is still a long way to go in this. I think it's really important, and it's a very good discussion. Thank you very much.
Dr. Frannie?
So Frannie had to leave, so she left at 7:30 sharp.
Oh, okay. I thought you would answer. Anyway, Montek, you want to conclude the discussion? Just
I think the
cover
best way to conclude the
left out
discussion
or you
is
can
to
comment.
thank you for inviting me and to thank everybody who's spoken. This is what they call a rich discussion, which really means you need to reflect a lot. Lots of useful ideas, lots of ideas that I don't necessarily agree with. But I think this is something that we have to do a lot more work on. I mean, remember, we're only just starting. So my own view, I've always held the view, whatever you're pushing, just define what you think can be done in the next 5 years. It won't add up to what is necessary, but at least it let us focus on where we need to get, and are we at least meeting those targets. So thank you all.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much. Thank
Thank
you.
you so much, sir.
Everybody.
Thank you so much.
And all the listeners, patient. Sorry, I couldn't get to all because I think the speakers did not restrict themselves to 10, 15 minutes. Anyway, okay, over to you, Charan.
Well, I
Thank
have
you.
a very, very important announcement to make. Of course, today's rich discussion will be on our website tomorrow by noon, and I'm sure you're going to use it often. But the most important announcement that I want to make is the team that is coming next week. We have an equally important team. The topic is going to be on global monetary coordination, and the speakers are Ben Friedman from Harvard, Jeffrey Frankel from Kennedy School, and Lawrence Ball from Johns Hopkins. So I hope you will all join and take advantage of their presence with us. So the best three speakers talking to us on monetary policy coordination, and obviously the issue of inflation targeting is going to come up. So let me repeat again, Ben Friedman from Harvard. Jeffrey
What time?
The timing is 6 to 7.
1:46.
Because they are from the East Coast, all the three of them. So we have kept the same time, 6 to 7:30. Ben Friedman, Jeffrey Frankel, and Lawrence Ball.
Yeah, well, you got an excellent combo. I would recommend to everybody. Ben Friedman, of course, was my third thesis advisor. So I know him very well, but the others also I know. And I'm sure all of you will benefit from this discussion.
So thank you very much.
Thank you,
And
sir.
see you next week.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Sir.